The floor is yours, Nancy.
Okay, so I am going to give a talk on this paper. It's called Performance Comparison, Support Vector Machine in Random Forest and Extreme Learning Machine for Intrusion Detection. So yeah, it's kind of like in the domain that we were talking about before. So we already know the basis of what the intrusion is in regards to cybersecurity. It's when there's unauthorized access to a system. So what are the consequences of an intrusion? There are financial losses, the IT infrastructure is compromised, there's hardware damage, and pretty much your information is leaked to unknown parties. So what can we do about it? How can we tie in machine learning, or what did the authors do in order to look at machine learning models? They looked at a bunch of papers and they picked the few models that these papers supported, or looked at their conclusions and decided whether or not it was a good machine learning model to test. So they picked out 3, which was support vector machines, random forest, and ELM, extreme learning machine, which is just another name for a neural network, a feed-forward neural network. The dataset they use is the Network Security Laboratory Knowledge Discovery dataset. It's a dataset that was derived from originally the KDD99 dataset, which was from the KDD Cup in 1999 competition. So how did they evaluate these models? They evaluated upon 2 things, the false alarm rate and the detection rate. So the first machine learning model they looked at was the support vector machine. They had a boatload of references to other papers that they looked at. Let's say, like, if we can just skim over these papers, you can see that these effective rateness, or the accuracies or detection rate that they list, are pretty high. But you can see that in red, one of the caveats with the SVM machine learning model is that it performs worse on larger data versus smaller data. There are different varieties of data sets that are used. We have the NSL KDD, and then we have the KD Cup 99 data set, but they're all derived similarly, very similar to one another. If not, I think the current data set that they use for this group of researchers is derived from the KD Cup 99 data set. You can also see that down here, we have the KPCA, which is used for feature reduction. And then over to the right, you can see that we have another kind of like a dimension reduction, or some sort of feature selection, which is the hypergraph generic algorithm for hyperparameters and feature selection. Basically what it's telling us is that data needs some sort of feature selection or dimension reduction in order to be processed. And so what's the takeaway from support vector machines that the authors made? They said SVM is not scalable. So the second machine learning model they looked at was random forest. What is a random forest? A random forest is an ensemble of decision trees. Decision trees are, you basically take a parent node and then it proposes this numeric threshold, and it provides all the child nodes are subclasses or classes of this particular proposed. So like a yes, no question, or is it greater than a particular number, or a string match. There were 3 papers that they mentioned. Again, you can see the pros to these models, these papers that were proposed, is that they have high detection rates. But the con for random forest in general for them is that it's slow to actually classifying a sample. So it's slow for real-time protection. The last model they looked at was the extreme learning machine. It's really tough to say it that way, but basically it's just a feed-forward neural network. In the paper they looked at, right there, they looked at a particular model that had a single layer feed-forward neural network. What it proved was that by selecting random weights and initializing the weights randomly for the hidden layer biases, it makes the model prone to learn faster and generalize better. On the right side, you can see the basic graph for a basic neural network, but I think that's the specific one from the paper, where we have an input layer, the hidden layer, and an output layer. You can see the hidden layer is dense and the output layer isn't. The bottom right is the mathematical notation of how to represent this neural net. So what is the proposed models or model that they decided upon to test? They have for SVM, they have an SVM with a kernel called the radical basis function. They have a distance metrics, and they're using Euclidean distance. What's the pros? Minimal parameter adjustments. What's the cons? It's expensive to train. It does poorer on larger data, as you could see from the original SVM model papers that they looked at. They picked a very generic random forest. They didn't write much about it, so I can't say much about it. But what's the pro to a random forest? It's less prone to overfitting than its single model decision tree. In the ELM, they just picked the generic model from what I know of. They picked a single or a multi-hidden layer feed-forward neural network. Oh, by the way, if you have 2 or more hidden layers in a neural network, it's called a deep neural network. So how do they evaluate? Well, they have the NSLKDD dataset. They separated this dataset into 3 subclasses. They have the full dataset, the half dataset, and 1/4 of the dataset. Of course, they're testing upon the size of the dataset. The full dataset has about 65,000 samples. They did an 80-20 split. What kind of metrics did they use to determine how well these models did? They used precision, recall, and accuracy. To the right, you can see that I had some pictures of the formulas they used. But if you can see on the right, I circled the last one, recall, because I had, I think that was kind of like, I think it was a mistype. I think they meant true positive or true positive plus false negative, but it depends on what they're describing as P. But yeah, that bothered me. So what kind of results did they get? For precision, as you can guess, that EML did a lot better than all the previous other models on the full data set. SVM in general, both the linear and the kernel RBF did better on half in the quarter data set. For recall, it's pretty much the same kind of results. ELM does better on the whole data set. SVM, linear, and RBF do better on smaller data sets. Accuracy, okay, so this was really bizarre for me that they actually had no commentary on the accuracy of the models for the 80-20 split, but they did another run of tests on a 90-10 split, and they made commentary on the 90-10 split. So these are more images of the 90-10 split. I didn't want to specifically say more about it because they pretty much reiterate the same thing. The neural net does a whole lot better on the larger full sample subset versus SVM does very well on the smaller subsets. Conclusion, it's the same thing I just said. The SVM performs well on smaller data sets, so the half and the 1/4, but it doesn't scale well to the largest data set. EML is the most suitable of all the models tried in this paper for very large sets. Okay, so now this is where I come in. So I'm done with the actual particular paper, but these are some of my commentaries that I made about the paper as I went along. Some things that bothered me was, one, they did not mention a lot of hyperparameters besides the kernel. They didn't tell us how many trees were in the random forest, or how deep the forest was, or how many layers were used in the neural net, or how many neurons were set to each hidden layer. They didn't tell me about how they processed the data, how did they represent the data, or how long or how many epochs did they train the data on for the ELM. That kind of bothered me, but normally a person who's not in this field probably would overlook it, but as a person in this field, I feel like they should have included it. Two, I was bothered that they ignored accuracy for the 80-20 split, but they talked about it in the 90-10 split. I don't know why they did that. It kind of confused me for a few minutes until I had to go look back. So, but they probably will fix that, like maybe in the actual official publication. 3, mistypes. I hope they fix those in the final publication. Yeah. 4, what really bothered me sometimes was they referenced so many other papers in this particular paper, but they didn't use their hyperparameters. And I thought they were crediting so many things to these papers that were very generic, like SVM doesn't scale well. I'm like, yeah, I thought that was pretty basic, but I don't know. So I have more. So another one I had a problem with is that for the conclusion, they pretty much made two statements, that ELM is used for big data and SVM is used for smaller data. But the problem with that for me is that, well, that means only one is really meant for real-time intrusion detection, since RF is not really good for real-time intrusion detection. But if the authors knew that they are looking towards, they already know what a neural net can do for larger data and an SVM for smaller data, I think it would have been more helpful if they tried some sort of hypothesis testing on it to validate that their conclusion is not just a conclusion, but their conclusion has meaning and has some sort of heavy work to it. So the random forest is an ensemble method. Generally, ensemble methods are more powerful than a single model. So I kind of was bothered that they were comparing single models to an ensemble. And yes, though random forests are better than a single decision tree because the single ones usually tend to overfit, I think it would have been better if they had more parameters for a single decision tree to avoid overfitting and compare single models to single models. 3, so I had to go look up the data set and information about the data set to understand how the data is formatted and how the data set itself is processed. They spend a lot of time referring other papers as well as explaining very generic basic concepts about the models. But I think they should have spent more time explaining maybe a paragraph or two on things that maybe someone in the field wouldn't know offhandedly. Like, even though the SVM has kernels, I didn't know about this particular kernel. So I thought maybe if they spent the paragraph on that kernel, I would understand it more than a basic definition of what SVM is, very basic. So what are the pros? Okay, after all those things I've said that I didn't like, there are pros. I think this paper is necessary. I think it's better to have a paper on this topic than not. A lot of research is done this way. It's better to have 100 research papers supporting an idea and having retrials than to have only one paper on it and no retrials. So yes, I think it is important. I just wish they added more, like maybe a hypothesis testing, but whatever. I think it's a clear example of what it means for SVM and neural networks and how they perform when it comes to sizes of data. I think you can clearly see that SVM is really good at classification of medium-sized data and smaller, and it might be preferred for smaller systems. But neural networks are great for really big data. So you might have a system, if you know the data is finite and it's not exponentially growing, that it might be good to use an SVM model versus a neural net. But it's really up to what the purpose of the data and what kind of influx of data volume it is. Yeah, and so that's the end of the presentation.
Nancy, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. If this was an in-class presentation, we would all be clapping for you right now. Sorry, we can't do this very well-deserved praise. Now, we have 10 minutes for discussion, questions, thoughts, and comments. Lisha has had her hand up for a few minutes now. Lisha, would you like to share your thoughts?
Nancy, you make a lot of comments about how they've referenced a lot of papers, but I didn't actually look at your paper, but is your paper a literature review rather than an actual research paper? Because that changes the format and how things are referenced in the paper.
Well, this particular paper is that they looked at all these papers and they were picking their own models to test. So I assume if they're doing that, then, you know what I mean, there is a part on their end that they're not just reading other people's papers and critiquing, compiling something, they're actually running their own models. If that makes sense. So I don't necessarily think it might be a big part of a literature review, composition, but I don't think that was the true intent of testing these models, because I think there would have been a bigger takeaway if they decided upon using more meaningful hyperparameters or hyperparameters if they were going to reference these other papers. But a lot of the papers they referenced, they were very generic in the sense that, what did you take away from this? Well, they said, oh, it's not scalable. It's not scalable. I'm like, okay, so do I really need to reference all those papers just to know that SVM in general is not scalable? I don't know.
Okay. Before I put in a seed question, does anybody have any other thoughts or comments they would like to share? All right, I'm going to start with this simple question. Who here, other than Nancy, can tell us what the point of the paper is? Just Joshua? Anybody else? So, Joshua, would you like to share your answer with us?
Yeah, as far as it's basically taking several different models, applying them for intrusion detection, and then basically it's a comparison of the performance of each model.
That's very true, Nancy. Do you have anything to add to that?
That is completely true what he said. They pretty much compared the performance. Now, how much of their conclusion is left to be desired, I don't know. That one's up. That one, I think they could have worked on. But I think Joshua has hit it on the nail on the head in terms of what they have done in the paper.
So the problem they're trying to solve is the intrusion detection problem. They use the KDD99 dataset as a benchmark, the NSL KDD dataset as a benchmark. I think we have all seen this dataset before. We've used it before as an example in the class. Do you think that this dataset is, or does it provide a good benchmark for performance analysis of intrusion detection models? Any thoughts on this? Joshua?
Well, I'm probably biased because my presentation was on a data set itself, Ember. But no, I was gonna say that if I'd recommend that multiple data sets be used because, you know, as was mentioned, that this is an old data set. You know, newer data sets probably more updated, might provide different results, but I think limiting the research to one data set is, you know, it handicaps the research.
I agree with you. I completely agree with you. I want to add or remind you of something. The NSL KDD dataset, if I recall correctly, does not come with timestamps. So the temporal relationships between different data points is lost. One more very interesting thing about this dataset is the data points in this dataset are not IID. If you remember, IID refers to, who can tell me what IID stands for? Nobody? Independent and identically distributed. So some of the logs in this dataset are from TCP connections, and some of the traces are corresponding to handshakes or particular events that may be in response of a previously logged event. So the data points are not necessarily independent of each other. Why does this matter? It matters because, well, the IID-ness of data, training data, is one of the core assumptions behind core assumptions in the training algorithms for the certain models this paper studies. This is one of the bigger problems that security data science in general has to deal with. The data points are not IID. They may be very related to each other. They may be very dependent on each other. And figuring out ways of either making these data points independent and identically distributed, or coming up with algorithms that do not depend too much on this assumption is a problem. Another question that I wish to pose at this point is, are there any practical implications? Does this paper and its findings have any practical implications? Nancy, do you have any thoughts on this?
So, I mean, I think this was really just meant to compare the models on a very, very generic basis. I mean, coming off of what you just said, that the data set is probably highly locally important, like data points are very related to each other. It may have been worth to use a very different type of deep neural network, maybe like a CNN or something like that. But yeah, I don't think this data, this actual, what they have done itself is useful right now. It was just this kind of, I guess, encourage the use of deep neural nets in larger data sets.
Very interesting observation. Yes, so essentially a very practical implication of their findings is if you're dealing with large data sets, you have to bite the bullet and go for the more expensive type of models. SVM is typically a lot less expensive to deploy and run than neural networks in terms of computational power required and memory requirements. But that said, Lisha has also made a very good point. This data set, the data set that they performed their study on, is more than a decade old. Why does this matter? Well, the type of traffic has changed over time. The type of network traffic has changed over time, and this data set may not be representative of the traffic one would encounter today if they were to look at network traces and such. So models trained on this data set may not prove useful for the security problems of today or the intrusion detection task in this time period. But in general, as Nancy mentioned, the study is useful because it allows us to, it facilitates our decision on what type of model we should use or we can't use depending on the size of our data set. Nancy?
So you know how like we usually tend to say that because it's a public data set and stuff, private tends to be better or more complicated because they're getting paid, they're and enterprise stuff. But would like that kind of model that they propose is that like the model at the time? Was that meant to be an enterprise kind of idea, or was that meant to be just a public general paper?
So as you mentioned while we were describing the KDD dataset, this dataset was collected during a competition. So by definition, the collection environment is virtual, it's not real. However, there are some interesting advantages. There are interesting pros that can be found in this dataset. The most notable one, in my opinion, is the fact that the data points are labeled. So events and network logs are labeled as whether they are benign or malicious, and if they are malicious, what type of malicious interaction they represent. This is very useful when want to train supervised models. When you work at an enterprise and you have a data set of enterprise level logs, one of the biggest problems is to come up with labels for individual data points in that data set. And before attacking this particular problem of labeling, one thing you can do is to test your architecture on this benchmark and try to figure out solutions to kinks, particular kinks in the architecture or your choice of architecture, and then move forward to more expensive, more ad hoc tasks. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Very well. Let's move on to the next presentation by Joshua. Joshua, would you like to share your screen with us?